Sheila Jeffreys, es de habla anglosajona, dará su ponencia en inglés, será traducida de manera simultánea en la pantalla, pero antes de que eso suceda y ella pueda dar su ponencia, vamos a presentarla. Es un verdadero honor dar la bienvenida a una de las grandes pensadoras del feminismo radical, Sheila Jeffreys. Su nombre está íntimamente ligado a algunas de las transformaciones intelectuales más profundas que ha vivido el movimiento feminista desde la década de los años 70. Autora, teórica, activista y maestra, Sheila Jeffreys ha dedicado toda su vida a analizar las raíces estructurales del patriarcado y a cuestionar con lucidez implacable las formas con las que ésta se reinventa bajo el capitalismo y en la sexualidad contemporánea. Doctora en Ciencias Políticas y profesora durante décadas en la Universidad de Melbourne. Jeffreys pertenece a esa generación de mujeres que entendieron que el feminismo no era una rama del pensamiento liberal, sino una revolución epistemológica y política. Su compromiso intelectual y vital ha hecho de ella una referencia ineludible para todas las que creemos que el feminismo no puede reducirse a una identidad o a un sentimiento, sino que es, ante todo, una posición política frente al poder. Desde los años 70, cuando fundó Leeds Revolutionary Feminist Group, y organizó las primeras Recline the Night en el Reino Unido, eso tiene más pinta de fiesta que de otra cosa, pero bueno, en el Reino Unido, hasta sus ensayos más recientes, Sheila ha sostenido una línea de pensamiento coherente, riguroso y profundamente ética. En obras como The Spirit and the Her Enemies o Anticlimax, recuperó la genealogía moral y política del feminismo victoriano, reivindicando la resistencia de las mujeres frente a la prostitución y el ideal masculino de la sexualidad. En Industrial Vagina, la industria de la vagina, ese sí me lo he leído, Sheila, ese reading, diseccionó con precisión las dinámicas globales de la prostitución y el tráfico sexual como una industria multinacional de la violencia. En Gendehar, uno de sus textos más debatidos y valientes, defendió la necesidad de preservar la categoría mujer como sujeto político del feminismo, frente a la disolución postmoderna del cuerpo y la experiencia femenina. Cada uno de sus libros nos desafía a pensar con independencia, a revisar nuestra certeza y a recuperar la fuerza moral del feminismo como movimiento de liberación. Su estilo, claro, directo y sin concesiones, combina la erudición académica con una profunda pasión política, recordándonos con el pensamiento feminista que no es un ejercicio de teoría abstracta, sino una práctica de coherencia, de resistencia y de verdad. La presencia de Sheila Jeffreys hoy en Cádiz tiene un valor inmenso. Que una de las fundadoras del feminismo radical anglosajón dialogue con las nuevas generaciones en una universidad pública andaluza es sin duda un acontecimiento histórico. Cádiz, ciudad de memoria rebelde, abre sus puertas así a una de las voces más lúcidas del pensamiento crítico contemporáneo. Querida Sheila, su visita nos recuerda que el feminismo, cuando es honesto consigo mismo, no busca complacer al poder, sino decir lo que el poder no quiere oír. Gracias por enseñarnos que pensar también es un acto de valentía y que nombrar la verdad sigue siendo una de las formas más profundas de libertad. Muchas gracias, Sheila. Muchas gracias a todas.
Hello, sisters. I'm going to talk about Male Sexuality and the Social Control of Women. The first paper I wrote on this concept was back in the late 1970s. I wrote it then with other revolutionary feminists. We called ourselves revolutionary feminists as a result of a paper I wrote back then called The Need for Revolutionary Feminism, which criticized the lack of revolutionary seriousness in what was radical feminism at that time. I think we need it again now. I wrote about it again as a chapter in my book, Penile Imperialism, from 2022. I still think it's a very important understanding for the creation of feminist revolution and women's liberation. The scale, scope, and variety of forms of men's sexual violence towards women is very considerable, and I cannot cover it all here. I will concentrate on sexual violence against women in the public world, outside the home, and concentrate on looking at the effects on women's lives of men's sexual harassment. All forms of men's violence restrict women's lives and opportunities. They circumscribe women's human rights to work, to freedom of assembly, and freedom of movement, and freedom to take part in cultural and political activities. Sexual harassment in the form of sexualized outdoor advertising and graffiti serves to mark the built environment as male and limits women's rights to equal citizenship. Men's sexual violence in all its forms ensures women's awareness of their second-class status and constructs the way in which women interact with the world. The idea of women's equality with men makes no sense whilst every aspect of women's lives is circumscribed by men's violence. However, many aspects of men's violence are not taken seriously. They are blamed on women, hidden, or compartmentalized, so that the whole picture of how women's lives are affected cannot be grasped. The focus of this talk is the practice seen before feminists named it in the 1970s and made its harms visible as benign or natural sexual harassment. First of all, I will explain what I mean by social control. Male sexologists and criminologists have traditionally seen men's sexual violence as something which individual men do to individual women. This has led them to explain the violence as being the result of a perpetrator's circumstances and childhood, and very often to blame the women in his life, the victims themselves, his mother or his wife. There is no recognition in their work that this violence serves male domination or men as a group, or has effects upon women as a sex caste. This individualist approach was challenged by the groundbreaking research and theorizing of feminists in the 90s, 70s, and 80s, such that by the 1990s, the mainstream view was being seriously undermined. Feminists argued that men's violence against women is political, a practice by which women are subordinated for the benefit of men and male domination. The failure of patriarchal states to take men's violence seriously suggests that the violence serves the interest of these states and their male citizens. In the 1970s and 80s, when radical feminists were creating a feminist analysis of male violence, we used the concept of social control to explain its effect upon women. Feminists took this concept from the discipline of sociology, where it is deployed to represent the way in which states use various forms of force to control dissent. These means may be informal and consist of persuasion and encouragement, or of inclusion and exclusion. But underneath these tactics, social scientists explain, there lies actual brute force, the iron fist in the velvet glove. Police forces and the military are understood in this analysis as the enforcers whose potential deployment underlies democratic capitalist societies. The police are there to undertake day-to-day control, whereas the military can be called upon when serious challenges arise. In relation to the subordination of women, the use of actual force has not been well recognized as an instrument of social control. It has been more usual to restrict the understanding of social control of women to forms of socialization or to action by the state of informal kinds, and to omit entirely the behavior of individual men. Violence against women by men has mostly been seen as the actions of individuals rather than as a political force. Kate Millett, in her 1970 book, Sexual Politics, which was one of the foundational texts of radical feminism and the women's liberation movement, however, did argue that men's violence against women should be seen as social control, which resembled the enforcement measures of the state towards its citizens in general, but was directed by individual men to make women compliant with men's needs. She said, "We are not accustomed to associate patriarchy with force. So perfect is its system of socialization, so complete the general assent to its values, so long and so universally has it prevailed in human society, that it scarcely seems to require violent implementation." She recognized the crucial importance of sexual violence to this system. Patriarchal force also relies on a form of violence, particularly sexual in character, and realized most completely in the act of rape. I will now go on to talk specifically about sexual harassment. The form of sexual harassment that's been most focused upon in feminist research and theory is that which takes place in the workplace. This is mainly because employers could be found to have legal liability, and there was therefore some recourse, which does not exist in relation to harassment in public places. I shall concentrate on the more common problem of street harassment in this talk. Catherine McKinnon has explained very usefully why sexual harassment of women is not taken seriously. She explains that this male practice is only seen as a problem if it takes place in another hierarchy besides that which exists between men and women. Thus, it can be understood in the context of a university if male staff harass female students because there is a clear hierarchy of power. It can be understood in a workplace if a male in a position of authority harasses a woman employee. But if the male harasser and the woman victim are apparently in equal positions, that is, if both students or both employees are at the same grade, or simply both pedestrians walking in the street, then the harm cannot be seen, and women are simply told to be a bit sturdier and say, "Go away." She explains the issue thus. The way the analysis of sexual harassment is sometimes expressed now, and it bothers me, is that it is an abuse of power, not sexuality. This does not allow us to pursue whether sexuality, as socially constructed in our society, through gender roles, is itself a power structure. She says that understanding the harm of sexual harassment requires a recognition that what she calls gender, but was more usually, before the late 1980s, called by feminists sex, class, or sexed caste, is a hierarchy, and that there is always power involved when men approach women sexually. It seems to me that we haven't talked very much about gender as a hierarchy, as a division of power, in the way that's expressed and acted out primarily, I think, sexually. Sexual harassment, then, is an expression of power through sex. Another reason that sexual harassment has been hard to recognize as harmful, McKinnon says, is that it is common for feminists to make distinctions between violence and what is just ordinary sex, as if there was some benign form of sex which was unbesmirched by the hierarchy of power between the sexes. She explains that rape cannot be sequestered off from ordinary sexual intercourse, or pornography from erotica, because all sexual practice is constructed from power relations. This applies, she points out, to sexual harassment too, which cannot be easily distinguished from male sexual initiation, because both practices are constructed from the same value system. Sexual initiation by men, which is generally indistinguishable from sexual harassment, is a problem that the powerful caste, men, do not suffer. I used to ask my female students whether it was sexual harassment or sexual initiation if a man came up to them while they were sitting on a bench on campus reading a book and tried to initiate contact. The young women hated being interrupted, but accepted this as something that men had the right to do. After my lecture, the great majority understood that it was sexual harassment. Men are not interrupted by members of a more powerful group who can demand their attention while they sit on a bench reading a book, walk to the bus stop, or sit in a train carriage. They have freedom in public space in a way that the male sexual initiative makes very difficult for women. The practice and acceptance of the male sexual initiative makes sexual harassment ubiquitous and difficult to fight. I'm now going to talk about the development of feminist research and writing on sexual violence. This proliferated in the 1970s and 80s as concern was extended from the issue of rape and violence from men in the home to sexual harassment in the workplace, to child rape in the home, known euphemistically as incest, to pornography and prostitution. Violence against women was not covered, however, in the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in 1979, CEDAW, commonly called the Women's Convention. This was increasingly recognized as a serious omission, and feminists campaigned for the 1993 Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Though the declaration does not have the power of a convention, it's a very useful articulation of the understanding of how male violence works in the subordination of women, and has proved an invaluable resource for feminists campaigning on this issue since that time. The preamble explains how male violence against women is political. Violence against women constitutes a violation of the rights and fundamental freedoms of women and impairs or nullifies their enjoyment of those rights and freedoms, and says that violence against women is a manifestation of historically unequal power relations between men and women, which have led to domination over and discrimination against women by men and to the prevention of the full advancement of women, and that violence against women is one of the crucial social mechanisms by which women are forced into a subordinate position compared with men. Article 3 of the Declaration sets out the human rights and fundamental freedoms that are impaired thereby, such as the right to life, the right to equality, the right to liberty and security of person, the right to equal protection under the law, the right to be free from discrimination, the right to health, the right to just conditions of work, and the right not to be subjected to torture. The Declaration does not specifically include in its list the rights that are particularly threatened by sexual harassment in the street, such as freedom of movement and freedom of assembly, but I will be concentrating on them today. A number of techniques have been employed by sexologists, governments, lawyers, perpetrators, and the media to deny or hide men's sexual violence so that we cannot see its scope and significance. Patricia Romito, in her excellent and comprehensive, though short work on how men's sexual violence is obscured, a deafening silence, hidden violence against women and children, provides a very useful account of the variety of techniques that conceal and invisibilize it. Romito explains that men's violence is functional to male domination and uses the concepts of social control to explain its efficacy. She says, far from consisting of behavior that is deviant or can be explained by the psychological problems of the individual man, male violence represents a rational means which, in order to work effectively, as in fact it does work, needs an organized system of mutual support and widespread complicity by society. It is precisely because of this, she argues, that opposing male violence is such a formidable task. It's not just a question of changing the law and behavior, but of bringing into question a structured and deep-seated system of control. And so it is not conceivable, and in fact does not happen, that those benefiting from this system will let it be dismantled or limited without opposition. Writing at a time when much earlier feminist analysis had disappeared from the academy and from popular culture, Romito sets out to explain how this process of hiding male violence takes place. One technique is the practice of compartmentalization, which requires that the full range of forms of male violence are never addressed together, but must, if they are to be looked at all, be dealt with one at a time so that the extent and significance are obscured. Thus, child rape in the home is approached separately from something euphemistically called paedophilia, in which men rape stranger children. Similarly, men's exposure of their penises to women and girls in public place is treated as mildly amusing and quite separate from men's sexually motivated murder of women who are kidnapped or attacked in public places. Romito identifies what she calls two principal strategies which emerge from analyzing male violence in recent history, legitimizing and denying. In legitimizing, male violence is not hidden in any way, it's visible, but as it is legitimate, it is not defined as violence. This strategy is principally applied to men's violence within the family, against those people, women and children, that they consider their property. These actions and toleration of them are codified in laws. The examples she gives are the conjugal exemption, which has meant that men may rape their wives with impunity because all forms of sexual use of one's property is seen as legitimate and state regulation or toleration of prostitution. Another form of legitimization is to blame women for the violence that men commit. The women who are blamed could be the mothers or wives of the perpetrators and the girls who are the victims. I explained how this works in a paper I wrote for a conference in 1980 on indecent exposure, sometimes called exhibitionism and commonly called at that time flashing. My analysis was that flashing, like other forms of street sexual harassment, should be seen as terrorism. I argue that flashing is a crude way of showing authority, like wearing a prefect's tie, or flashing your identity card might be if you were a policeman. But at the same time, it is the clearest and simplest way of demonstrating power under male supremacy. A flasher's message is simple: I rule because I have a penis. I say in my paper, we must make it clear that we see flashing as an act of aggression and threat, an act of sexual terrorism. Indecent exposure is not a joke, it's an act of war. The sexological work on flashing that I gathered blamed women, usually the wives or mothers of the perpetrators, or in some cases the victims themselves. An early book on the topic by the sexologist Rickles in 1950 is a case in point. He explains that to understand the exhibitionist, one must first understand the woman of his life, the mother. The blameworthy mothers were extremely narcissistic women, unconsciously motivated by strong penis envy. They fell into two categories. They would either be masculine in appearance and apt to be strong-willed, aggressive, and openly hostile to all males. Surely there's nobody like that here. Or they would be clinging vines. Mothers of schizophrenics, he said, were similarly to blame for their sons' problems. Rickles describes one such mother as wearing mannish clothes with an oversized hat and speaking in a brusque voice with deep overtones. Unfeminine mothers, he considered, created sex offenders or men with serious mental health problems. Another of the strategies employed to disappear feminist analysis of men's violence was to change language so that men's agency could be hidden. This was done by the increasing replacement of the term sex by the term gender. There has been a determined euphemizing of men's violence against women by calling it gender violence, for instance, without specifying that the so-called gender involved was actually men. The fundamental human right of women that is restricted by sexual harassment is freedom of movement. Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right to freedom of movement, but women's access to this human right is severely circumscribed by a variety of forms of men's sexual behavior. When girls and women walk in public space, they face sexual harassment from boys and men, which can range from name-calling to touching to murder. This deters women from walking for leisure, creates problems for women who need to use public space to get to work, education, shops, and other necessary facilities. I shall give a few examples of how sexual harassment takes place and affects women. My first example is the city of Melbourne, Australia, which was awarded the status of the world's most livable city for 7 years running, until it lost the top spot to Vienna in 2018. The Age newspaper in Melbourne reported that sexual offences on the state of Victoria's public transport system surged by 60% in 3 years. The Productivity Commission in that state reported at the same time that nearly a third of Victorians felt unsafe using public transport at night. It is not likely that many of these are men feeling unsafe because they might be attacked by women, though the figures are not disaggregated. Train stations were particularly unsafe, with the main Melbourne station, Flinders Street, the scene of 127 reported offences in 1 year, and offences up by 70% overall at stations in 3 years. The offences included groping, molesting and rape, and they occurred despite the deployment of 1,400 protective services officers at the city's stations. Then sexual violence in this case occasions considerable public outlay. It is treated as if it is a natural calamity that needs to be guarded against, rather than a form of behaviour that could be changed. Melbourne is a relatively accommodating city for women who venture into public space, compared with other places where women's right to move freely is much more fiercely contested by men. It does seem likely that in places and in communities in which women's right to enter public space is less secure, such as India, Egypt, and areas of Western cities where particularly patriarchal communities are concentrated, sexual harassment is more severe. Men in these regions and communities may consider women in public space fair game because they should not really be there at all, and are inviting men's sexual response if they are. In India, for example, men's growing anxieties about women's self-determination has been identified as one reason for the high rates of sexual harassment, rape and murder of women which men are carrying out. In 2012, a young woman student who had moved to Brussels to study film and was shocked at the extent of the sexual harassment she received from the area of the city in which she lived, made a documentary to show what was happening. It's an area with a high immigrant population. She explained that walking around her local neighbourhood, the mixed working class district of Anessens, at any time of day she would be greeted with catcalls, wolf whistles and jeers of slag and how much do you cost. She found that she was not alone in this experience. Other women described the amount of labour they had to engage in to ameliorate the harassment. Female acquaintances admitted the problem was so bad they never went out in a skirt, avoided the metro, never made eye contact with men, avoid walking certain streets, never wore shorts, and in one case only ever left their house by bike. She walked about the streets of her neighbourhood followed by a camera person who filmed the way in which men behaved towards her, which consisted of a constant stream of remarks and sexual invitations. In 2014, the same exercise was repeated by a woman in New York who walked around for 10 hours wearing black jeans and a t-shirt. She was propositioned 100 times and had to endure men walking beside her, one for over 5 minutes. Feminist researchers explain that sexual harassment makes women afraid and changes our behaviour. Fiona Vera Gray explains that men's practices affect women's safety but also their freedom. She explains that the safety work mandated for women and girls in public functions to limit women's space for action and responsibilities and responsibilize them for preventing violence. Women routinely do what Vera Gray calls safety work, meaning that to keep themselves safe, they have to walk with keys clasped in fists, with points outwards, or take self-defense classes. Though the murder of women in public places is uncommon, awareness of the threat causes quite extensive safety work. In response to the murder of a woman who was jogging in Arkansas, a newspaper article listed the 5 other women killed whilst out for a run since 2017 in the US, 4 of them in 2019, and suggested the precautions women could take to avoid death. The article does not suggest that anything can be done to make men less dangerous, but rather advises women that to adopt extreme measures to increase their chances of staying alive. These include ditch the headphones so that they can listen out for dangers, avoid baggy clothes and ponytails so they cannot be easily grabbed, switch up your routine by constant changes of route, run with a group of friends to deter murderers, as well as letting others know where you are going so that they will know to notify the police if you disappear, and using your phone to share your location with friends. Also, women should use your body to protect yourself by walking confidently and learning self-defense, which of course is quite hard in this situation. Such recommendations transfer the responsibility from the perpetrator to the victim. They position sexual violence as an inevitability, some work of nature which cannot be changed. Another human right of women that is circumscribed by sexual harassment is women's participation in cultural life. Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts. This includes the right of individuals and communities to visit, make use of, maintain, exchange, and develop cultural heritage and cultural expressions. Women may have the right to such participations in the abstract, but the exercise of that right is trammelled by men's sexual expression. The exercise of men's sexual violence is easier and more problematic in some cultural sites than in others, though men are likely to intrude upon women's enjoyment of highbrow cultural facilities such as galleries, museums, and classical music venues, because this behaviour is ubiquitous. There are some forms of culture which present particularly heinous problems for women's participation. Popular music events, such as festivals and places of entertainment which include drinking and dancing, such as nightclubs, present major obstacles for women who might like to take part. The Bravalla Festival, Sweden's biggest, was cancelled for 2018 in response to the number of reported incidences of sexual violence at the 2017 event, 4 rapes and 23 assaults. In response, the festival was not held in the following year, and a women-only music festival was held instead. Ironically, this festival was found in breach of the country's gender discrimination law, because it discouraged a certain group from attending, namely men. No penalty was imposed, but it showed that women are not seen as justified in trying to evade men's sexual violence. If they wish to visit a festival, they must do so under circumstances which make them vulnerable, that is, the attendance of men. Women do not have equal opportunities to visit nightclubs either. The culture of nightclubs in the UK has changed in recent decades to reflect the values of the sex industry. The practice of allowing women into the clubs for free and giving them cheap drinks, whilst men pay full price, bears some resemblance to the practices of sex industry venues such as room salons in Korea and hostess bars in Japan. These latter venues offer women to men as hostesses, to lavish hospitality upon them, and perhaps be available for sexual use in rooms at the premises or on a take-out basis. They are frequented mainly by businessmen who use the women's services to bribe or make deals or just to entertain during business hours. Nightclubs in European countries are more egalitarian and less obviously part of the sex industry. But the direction of travel in providing women for men through incentives such as free and reduced prices is seen by some women observers as making offers to the male customers and increasing the chances that they will be seen as appropriate targets of sexual harassment and assault. A YouGov opinion poll in 2017 in the UK found that 79% of men said they expected inappropriate comments, touching and behaviour when they went out, either to themselves or to their female friends. In 2018, a study in which women were sent into a nightclub in Brazil in smart dresses which used heat sensors to record rough touching found that 3 women were groped 157 times in total in less than 4 hours. Another area of women's entry into public life that is beset by sexual harassment is women's political representation. An important aspect of feminist struggle has been to gain representation for women in legislatures internationally. This has had considerable success, but feminist political scientists point out there's been backlash from their male counterparts as well as from an angry male body politic. A study on the experience of 55 women members of parliament from 39 countries found that 81.8% had been psychologically abused, 44% had received death, rape, beating or abduction threats. This study is out of date now and it's likely that current percentages would be much higher. The abuse that black women MPs receive in the UK is both sexist and racist. The black MP Diane Abbott, who received an average 51 abusive tweets a day in one study period, got 10 times as much abuse during the 2017 election campaign as other women MPs. A high proportion of these were rape threats or directed at her appearance. Many women are now speaking out to say that the level of abuse will deter young women from entering politics. For the MPs themselves, a constant stream of hatred and sexualized abuse is likely to affect their ability to speak and act. The attacks on women MPs result not just from men's anger at women's temerity in intruding into men's command of public life, but also from the new technologies which have made the abuse effortless and anonymous. Another less remarked upon way in which the expression of male sexuality harms women's freedom in public space is the domination of visual space. As women walk or exercise in built environments, they are surrounded by advertisements which show women as sexualized objects for men's delight. The sexual messaging is often extremely clear in the way that the women's naked or almost naked bodies are positioned, and all the tropes of pornography are clearly employed. This is the case whether the advertisements are for products aimed at women or at men, from makeup and underwear through to cars and alcohol. In June 2021, for instance, a lingerie company, Honey Burdette, placed video displays in shopping centres in Australia featuring a near-naked woman in a few bondage straps, sexually choking herself while smiling and writhing in pleasure. Women and girls use shopping centres and cannot protect themselves from seeing women dressed as sex slaves strangling themselves for men's delight. This affects women, our experience of citizenship, our feelings about ourselves, our bodies, our worth and our safety. Men do not have to walk past walls and buildings plastered with images of themselves in various stages of nakedness and in poses which present them for sexual penetration. Andrea Dworkin expressed the problem well when she explained in 1997 that pornography should be seen as a form of social control of women, saying, "Think about pornography as social control, a democratic use of terrorism against all women, a way of saying to every woman, look down, bitch, because when you look up, you're going to see your legs spread." The media and politics scholar, Lauren Rosewarne, has written persuasively on this topic, arguing that both graffiti and sexualized outdoor advertising should be understood as forms of street harassment. He points out that there's been research to show that another form of men's assertion of their dominance on the landscape, graffiti, creates fear in public space, and that fear of crime is something experienced by women more frequently than men. But little research has been done to show the effect of outdoor advertising on women. She shows how, in a similar manner to graffiti and sexual harassment, such advertising charges public space with a male sexuality that makes women fearful of crime, and that sexualized advertisements like graffiti are symptomatic of male control of public space, which is thus exclusionary for women. He explains that just as tagging a blank wall is an externalization of masculinity, it can be argued that the same thing is happening in outdoor advertising. The erection of a sexualized billboard is a way for men to externalize their sexual interests and desires. He points out that if the images that women have to walk past every day were present in a workplace environment, this would be seen as creating a hostile work environment and be legally actionable. Women have no more choice than they do in the workplace of avoiding the imagery, except perhaps by seriously altering their journeys to take back streets, for instance. And so it should be recognized as sexual harassment, even though there is not the same possibility of legal redress. So I have concentrated today on the forms of sexual harassment that is not usually taken seriously by states. The most extreme forms are rape and sex murder. Through sexual harassment, public space provides men with a playground for their sexual excitements. Taken together, the many forms can be seen to have profound effects on women's lives and opportunities. They control where women may go and what they may do, including access to social life and entertainment, to work and politics. In lesser-known forms, such as visual terror, they reinforce women's subordination in the streetscape. But sexual harassment is not taken seriously by the government of male domination. It is not seen as on a par with racist abuse or the abuse of transvestites. For women to share in the rights and opportunities considered important for men, the abolition of sexual harassment is a necessity. Thank you.
Intentaremos traducir las preguntas que tengáis entre Cristina y yo lo mejor que podamos. Y nada. Yes, I understand that political lesbianism is as controversial here, the idea, as it is in just about everywhere else, except Korea. In Korea, huge numbers of women are becoming lesbians very enthusiastically. Ha dicho que entiende que aquí, como en la mayoría de lados, es controvertido, excepto en Corea.
I should do a definition, I guess, of political lesbianism, which is not a term I use as much as lesbian feminism. Political lesbianism we used in a paper back in 1979 in the UK, where we said that actually we did think that all feminists should become political lesbians.
They should all leave men, and they should all become lesbians.
Dice que ella lo diferencia del concepto de feminismo lésbico, el concepto de lesbianismo político, y que este concepto surgió en el año 79 en Inglaterra a través de un escrito y donde decían que todas las mujeres deberían ser lesbianas y dejar a los hombres.
We considered that all feminists should become political lesbians because it was the best way to fight the revolution. It was very difficult to do so with a man living in your house who said, not me, it's not me, it's not me, and so on. So it's the only really effective way to fight for the revolution of women, and we do mean for absolutely all women, but also there was the delight of being able to love women, and we need some fun. We actually do need some fun. Also, we understood that if you put all your loving energies into women as well as fighting the revolution with women, you are creating a closed circle of energy. You are not putting out all the energy where you have to be looking after men and being concerned about men and dressing yourself up as a sex slave and all of the things that women are expected to do within the institution of heterosexuality. You can have a closed circle, and that works pretty well. Worked pretty well in the 70s and 80s.
Bueno, habla de que para las feministas como ella, en ese texto hablaban de que era la única forma posible de revolución, pero no solo por eso, sino también por el hecho mismo también de amar a las mujeres y para crear un círculo cerrado de energía, donde esa energía no se fuera en la heterosexualidad, en la preocupación acerca de los hombres. No sé si me he dejado algo. Eso.
But the reason it's controversial now is that the great majority of us had not thought about being lesbians, you know, as children or as teenagers or whatever. We decided as adults to become lesbians, with some enthusiasm, it has to be said. It was not a difficult choice. But now there are quite a lot of lesbians, I believe, in Spain, as there are in many other countries, mostly young, who believe the ideas of the old male sexologists and scientists in the 19th century, that lesbianism was some kind of congenital flaw and you couldn't possibly choose it.
Dice que lo que puede generar más controversia es el hecho de que hayan escogido ser lesbianas como mujeres adultas y no como adolescentes en muchos casos, y que la sexología y la ciencia, digamos que sembraron un terreno para entender la lesbiandad como algo congénito y no como algo que podía escogerse.
And the important thing is that we do want this to start happening again. We want lots and lots and lots of women who'd not really considered it, who are feminists, to become lesbians and put all of their energy in fighting for all women that is, because lesbians have always been the heart of the women's liberation movement. We created the women's centres and the refuges and the bands and wrote all the books of theory. It was lesbians did pretty much all of that, it has to be said. And it's difficult to create a really powerful movement unless thousands, let's make it millions, why not, women start to do that again now. So I do recommend this course of action.
Ella considera que ahora está sucediendo de nuevo algo que ya sucedió antes en los 70, que queremos que suceda y que las lesbianas siempre han sido el corazón del feminismo porque han sido ellas las que han fundado todos los refugios, todos los centros de atención a las mujeres que habían sufrido violaciones, todas las librerías, y que ella quiere que esto suceda y está sucediendo también de nuevo.
Bueno, primero muchas gracias. Yo quiero hacer esta pregunta porque me preocupa considerar terror, utilizar esa palabra, a todas esas formas de violencia que has detallado, porque no refuerza acaso esa conceptualización, esa del terror, el hecho de darle a los hombres el poder sobre las mujeres, el poder de asustar, de causar daño. Eso no refuerza esa idea masculina de que en realidad tienen poder sobre nosotras.
I think we need to be honest. It is a state of terror. I mean, one of the things I didn't have time to talk about today was a couple of years ago in London, a young woman, about 30, 31, walking home from visiting a friend, was kidnapped by a policeman and raped and killed, carried in a car first of all for about an hour and a half, and then he raped and killed her. He's now in prison, fortunately. Other policemen have been since then imprisoned for these sorts of offences. So if it isn't a state of terror, I'm not quite sure what's going on out there. This is the police we're talking about, who are making it terrifying for women to walk around at night. I don't know why we shouldn't use that word. I think a reason women don't want to use that word, maybe, is because that is too frightening to them personally. To recognize the state of terror that we are living in, how dangerous it is. I mean, I used to, when I talked to my students about this violence, I would ask them what the things were that they did ordinarily. Of course, they carried the keys between their fingers as they walked along the street. I remember doing this at night. You walk along the street, and you look for which windows have got lights in case you need to run to that house, right? If that's not a state of terror, what the hell is it? And women have to, if they approach their car, they have to make sure there's not a man in the back seat. This is terror. I know it's terrifying to recognize it, but if we don't recognize it, if we don't take it really seriously, how can we begin to do something about it, to say to governments, to states, to all of these men, I'm sorry, this is not just, something individual or some kind of mental health problem. You can stop it. We can end masculinity. And we can end that from the moment a male child is born. They need never gain the behavior of masculinity and of power. It's as simple as that. But of course, the whole society is run in that way. And the men want to keep it. And they are happy with the situation. We could choose to change it. But men will not do that. Let's use the word terror and be serious and sensible about it.
Vale. Ella dice que hay que ser honestas, que es un estado de terror. Cuenta el caso de una mujer en Inglaterra que fue violada por un policía y asesinada, y que hay muchísimos otros casos similares de policías que han sido acusados por lo mismo. Dice que no sé por qué no deberíamos usarla y que quizás no la usamos por miedo a reconocer que es un estado de terror, ¿no? Y pone ejemplos como cosas que hacemos las mujeres, como llevar las llaves entre los dedos cuando vamos andando solas por las noches, y otros más ejemplos. Y se pregunta que si eso no es un estado de terror, ¿qué es? O sea, que entiende que es terrorífico reconocerlo, pero ¿cómo podemos hacer algo contra ellos si no lo reconocemos? No sé si me he dejado algo.
Sí,
Dale.
Sí, lo último que ha dicho es que se puede poner fin a la masculinidad desde el mismo momento en que nace un niño, hacer que no adquiera las herramientas, las características de la masculinidad.
Bueno, hola. Primero que nada, thank you for your lecture. Y quería preguntar sobre si considera que el control social del que nos estuvo hablando, con las redes sociales, el fenómeno global de la pornografía, incluso la inteligencia artificial, considera que se está sofisticando, que está evolucionando o incluso que sigue exactamente igual, solo que están cambiando los medios o ahora somos más conscientes. Bueno, un poco sí ve que la introducción de todos estos nuevos fenómenos están afectando de alguna manera a esa tesis, ¿no?, de los años 70-80.
In terms of pornography, back in 1977, I was involved in setting up the first anti-pornography group in the UK, which was in London, and it was just magazines. And we were absolutely horrified because those magazines, I saw little boys in the corner shop looking at pictures of women's genitals in magazines. I couldn't believe it. And so I set up an anti-pornography group. Can you imagine that is nothing compared with what is happening now? Nothing. But we knew it was woman hatred, and we were quite successful at that time in getting the pornography off the public transport, for instance.
Habla de, en el año 79, por aquel entonces eran revistas principalmente y se quedaban, pues digamos, horrorizadas al ver a chicos jóvenes mirando revistas con imágenes de genitales de las mujeres, y que es entonces cuando decidieron crear el grupo antipornografía en Londres. Y al final habla de que, no sé si lo he entendido bien, no es comparable con lo que está pasando ahora, ¿no, Cristina? Vale. Bueno, lo ha dicho al final, creo.
The situation of social media and AI and the creation of sexualized forms of women, the stealing of women's images off media, and the stealing of the faces of their children off their Facebook pages in order to sell them and exchange them for sexual. This is something that could not have been imagined, right? It's so extraordinarily serious that I am surprised that we are all managing to walk around in a normal way right now in the context of what is going on, compared with how horrifying it was in 1970 when we started the women's liberation movement. We could not have imagined. So there is just, I mean, for instance, one of the problems is that they talk about in the workplace, in terms of sexual harassment in the workplace and so on, there's a concept called unconscious bias, which some of you may be aware of. In workplaces now, they train against unconscious bias in discrimination, right? Whereas, in fact, pornography, the mere existence of pornography, means that all men, because all men have seen it, have unconscious bias, actually called prejudice, very, very serious prejudice against women, because they constantly use, or maybe just only sometimes, images of women, some of which they've stolen, some of which they've got from, putting their phones underneath women's skirts on the train. They use these images all the time. That terrible hatred of women fuels their sexual excitement, gets them up and gives them erections all the time. You cannot tell me. They go into work the next day and they think of women and see women as equal human beings. There is no way. Unconscious bias is a euphemism for a terrible hatred.
Bueno, habla de que todo lo que está pasando con las redes sociales, con la inteligencia artificial y de cómo ahora se ha llegado al punto de robar imágenes de las mujeres para utilizarlas a través de la inteligencia artificial y demás en la pornografía, que es algo que en el 79 había sido algo difícil de imaginar, de cómo podemos estar ahora, digamos, aquí tan normales y está sucediendo esto que ya era terrorífico en el 79 y que ahora pues todavía más, ¿no? Y habla también de un sesgo inconsciente, que es un eufemismo, dice ella, para, digamos, el terror hacia las mujeres, o sea, de los hombres hacia las mujeres, el terrorismo, del odio hacia las mujeres que les excita sexualmente a los hombres. No sé si me he dejado algo porque ha dicho muchas cosas.
Sí, que todos los hombres ven tanto porno que inconscientemente ya tienen ese sesgo y que no puede creerse que al día siguiente, cuando van al trabajo, tratan a las mujeres como sus iguales. Es imposible.
Vale, sí. Bueno, no sé si es una pregunta o como una reflexión, porque llevo aquí un rato pensando, lo que has dicho antes de la educación, acabar con la masculinidad mediante la educación. Creo que en el caso de los chicos es algo muy complicado porque cuando se trata de educar a los niños pequeños hasta que ya son mayores, es verdad que al principio de lo que más se empapa es de lo que ven en casa, quitando que familiares más lejanos, pero llega un momento en el que en el colegio, en la calle, sobre todo durante la adolescencia, incluso para encajar en el grupo, aunque no tengan ese pensamiento, terminan repitiendo comportamientos y patrones que lo que hacen es, terminan ejerciendo esa violencia contra sus iguales. ¿Cómo se puede hacer desde la familia, las madres, los padres, la comunidad educativa incluso, para que ese tipo de patrón no se termine repitiendo?
There is a crisis. Are we okay? Okay. There is a crisis right now with what's going on in schools, and I'm pretty sure it's happening in schools here in the same way it's happening in Australia and in the UK, which is the boy children are trained by pornography to treat girls as rubbish, really, and to sexualize them and to sexually assault them. So there have been quite several research studies in the UK and in Australia which show that little girls in primary school, this is 5, 6, 7 years old, are being grabbed by boys and sexually assaulted in toilets. They are being called terrible names. It's happening to the teachers too. The teachers women are dropping out of teaching because of the names they're called. They have 10-year-old boys corralling them on the staircase and shouting things at them and grabbing them in the school. I was a teacher, 50 years ago. I can't imagine what it must be like now, because we didn't have anything like that. So pornography has had many effects. And one of them is to make little boys of 6, 7, 8 years old haters and controllers and sexual abusers of women. But we're not really talking about that, because actually pornography has to go entirely go, not just for children. How could you make such a distinction? Anyway, the boys watch their father's pornography and they watch it with their fathers. So it all has to go. But first of all, I have to say, we need separate sex education. We have to have girls' schools. It's the only way to keep girls safe and give them an equal chance of having a reasonable education now. I would not wish to send my child to a school where she was going to be sexually abused by a child in the classroom. I would not wish to do that. So parents are in a very, very, very difficult situation. But we need to be seriously talking about it, setting up groups of parents and just anybody who's concerned to try and do something about it, and we have to get rid of the pornography.
Vale. Habla de la crisis que está habiendo en los colegios, por ejemplo, en Inglaterra, aquí en Australia y en otros lugares, ya que los niños están siendo entrenados por la pornografía, que hay estudios de niños desde los 5, 6, 7 años que están agrediendo sexualmente a sus compañeras de clase, e incluso niños también de 10 años que también están agrediendo a las profesoras, que ella como profesora pues, no puede imaginarse cómo sería serlo ahora con esta situación. Y bueno, sí, porque lo último...
La pornografía tiene muchísimos efectos y uno de ellos es que convierte a los niños en abusadores, acosadores sexuales. Ven el porno con sus padres, ese es el problema. Y Sheila aboga por las escuelas segregadas por sexo, porque a ella no le gustaría de ninguna manera enviar a su hija a una escuela mixta y opina que lo que debemos hacer es librarnos de la pornografía.
Nada, que solo quería puntualizar que no ha dicho que el porno no es solo malo porque lo vean los menores, que había que abolir toda la pornografía porque tampoco los adultos podemos ver pornografía.